Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer from PCN Global with Dr. Fathali Moghaddam, and we're here for the launch of Season 11, Episode 1, to talk about when policy connects to impact and research connects to impact and policy. So we're delighted to have Dr. Moghaddam here joining us from Washington, D.C. area. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia. For people who have not joined us before, on the podcast, this is live streamed on LinkedIn and YouTube. And then about a week or two later, we'll convert this to one of 110 episodes of the Social Change Career podcast. So we'd love to hear from people as this is live streamed. So feel free to let us know where you're watching from, bring in your questions and your comments. And the one request we have, if you like this podcast, this episode, which hopefully you will, please consider sharing or rating. And we have a great season lined up for Season 11 in terms of episodes. I will share a little bit about Dr. Moghaddam's bio. I will not read the whole bio because we would be here for quite a while. So Dr. Moghaddam is a professor of psychology at Georgetown University. He served as the director of the interdisciplinary program in cognitive science, director of the Georgetown Conflict Resolution Program. He was my boss for many years, and we collaborated in many ways. Editor-in-chief of the Peace and Conflict Journal Peace Psychology from the American Psychological Association. He also serves as the editor of Cambridge University Press's Progressive Psychology book series. And he was born in Iran and educated from an early age in England and returned to Iran with the revolution in 1979. During that period, he was researching and teaching during the hostage-taking crisis in the first 3 years of the Iran-Iraq War. He's conducted experimental and field research, as well as been involved in applied projects around the world in numerous contexts, and published I think over 20 books, maybe even 30 books on the psychology of conflict, radicalization, terrorism, democracy, and dictatorship. A couple of his current and forthcoming books include How Psychologists Failed, We Neglected the Poor, Favored the Rich and Privileged, and Got Science Wrong from 2022. Political Plasticity, The Future of Democracy and Dictatorship from 2023. And his next forthcoming book is called The Psychology of Revolution. He's been recognized for his work via a number of prestigious awards, including from the International Society of Political Psychology. And I'll share his website. You can find much more about his work and his interests at fathalimoghaddam.com. So Dr. Moghaddam, thank you so much for joining us. And if you could share a little bit just about, first where you're joining us from this morning, how your semester's starting, and how in the world, if you think back to a younger age, did you aspire to a career in applied research psychology, or were you aspiring to be a soccer or a cricket star? How did you move into psychology?
Well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted and honored to be with you. Like many other people, my life has really moved along by chance. Chance has played a huge role in what I've ended up doing. I could have ended up in many different ways. I had studied in England and returned to Iran, where I was born, with the revolution. And of course, like many other people, millions of people, the return to Iran was really based on hope that the country would move towards democracy and openness. And unfortunately, for various reasons, that did not work out. And after I think it was about 5.5 years, I had to leave, and I ended up going to Canada, where I was at McGill University for about 6 years. And again, chance played a huge role. It turned out that when I was in Canada at McGill University, there was Donald Taylor, who I had vague connections with before, and we started to collaborate together, and we remained very good friends until his death last year. And then by chance again, I came to Washington to be at Georgetown University. All of this was not planned. Like many other people's lives, it was a series of chance incidents. As for the link between research and practice, well, I've always believed in the dictum that the most practical thing is a good theory. I have met practitioners, including in conflict resolution, who claim that they don't need theory and research. But after talking with them for a while, it becomes obvious that they do have theories and they go into conflict resolution using theories, but they don't acknowledge the theories. So we all have theories about how people behave. Why did she say that to me? Is she jealous of me, or is she angry with me? We have these theories about how we all work in everyday life, but we often don't acknowledge these theories. And for me, the most practical thing is a very good theory. And practitioners need to have theories and explicit theories. That is, they make their theories public in order to assess them, in order to test them. And so that link between theory and practice is very strong in my mind, and I hope in my life.
Thank you so much. So welcome. We have people joining us. Welcome Matt from Colorado, Fiza from Pakistan, Tina from Delaware, a user from Mongolia. I don't think we've had anybody from Mongolia before. Mara from California. And people are starting to share their interests. So please keep letting us know where you're watching from, and your questions and comments. We'll bring them into the conversation. Feel free to share this with others. So obviously I've quoted you many times in terms of there's nothing as practical as a good theory. So going back to thinking about psychology or social psychology, when you were exploring studying psychology, there's many branches. And so for your own personal career and for others who are thinking about psychology, how did you decide on social psychology, and what's your advice for people who are interested in better understanding the behavior of individuals or societies and how they find the right path within psychology?
Well, I was unfortunate in that my father died at a very young age, and I was placed in a boarding school in London, and I felt very isolated in that I seldom saw my family. And at that time, I wanted to have an impact, particularly on issues of justice and the enormous inequalities that we have in all societies. And I thought I could do this by studying literature and producing works of literature that would address problems of inequality. But I was advised that this would be a very bad idea for somebody going back to Iran, because in Iran, the idea of publishing on these issues was not going to work. So the advice I got was, well, do something else that's related to the kinds of things you're interested in. And I thought of psychology as a possibility. And that's how I went into psychology, thinking it was a mechanism for trying to achieve some kind of social change. I was very disappointed because traditional mainstream psychology is very far from any issues of justice and change. So I really struggled for a while. And when I finished my PhD in England, the revolution was ongoing in Iran, and I thought, this is my opportunity. I was an experimental laboratory-based psychologist, and here was a real revolution happening. And so, like many, many others, I returned to Iran in the hope that I would be able to contribute. And it was really a relearning process. Relearning because most third world people like me who were born in the third world, when we go back to the third world from the West, we typically find that our education is really not suitable for work in third world countries. This is not just in psychology. I have friends who returned from the West after having studied engineering at the PhD level. There they were with very advanced ideas about centrifuges, and when they get back to their own country, they ask, well, what can I do? And the response is, well, you can help make a factory to produce soap. Now, they're not excited by making soap because they've been working on advanced centrifuges. So there's a mismatch between the education we receive in the West as people born in third world countries and what third world countries actually want from us. So I spent a number of years in Iran working on this idea that what is psychology for developing countries? And I've continued to work on this throughout the last 40 years. And there is now, fortunately, in psychology, some attention to this, psychology for developing countries. But we need more attention to this because a lot of the students who come abroad from third world countries get trained in the West to address questions that arise in California or in London and Paris. And those questions are really arising out of the needs of Western countries or from China or Russia if people are going there. So it is a mismatch. And a lot of my life, I've struggled with this mismatch.
Thank you so much. So lots of questions are coming in. So I'll ask two more, and then we'll start bringing in questions from the audience. So one, for thinking about anybody who is exploring postgraduate study at the doctoral level, whether they're from Turkey or Colombia or the US, because I know you get approached a lot, and whether, let's say in the social sciences, what is your general advice for people exploring a doctoral degree in terms of how to decide if it's worth the effort for that person and going about selecting a potential program, and your cautions and your encouragement?
Well, fortunately, there are increasing numbers of programs that link the social sciences, including psychology, with policy. For example, at Georgetown, we have a program where we have a Ph.D. in psychology and public policy. A number of other universities in the United States and in Europe now have this link with public policy. The other thing to think about, if you're interested in linking to policy, is perhaps do a master's in public policy first, and then think about doing the PhD. And again, fortunately, these are areas where funding is fairly good. In the area of public policy, funding is fairly good. So this is one way to link public policy with social science research. Of course, the challenge for people from non-Western societies is that most of the questions that are being addressed in public policy and social science arise out of the Western context. And it is a challenge to really address questions that are also applicable to non-Western societies. One of those questions for me is the issue of democratization and the last 20 years of experience that we've had with the demise of democracy, not just in the non-Western world, but also in the Western world. It seems to me this is a global phenomenon. Why are we experiencing a decline in democracy and a rise in authoritarian leadership? And I'm talking about this very frankly because I'm worried about the next US election. It's not at all clear to me what the outcome will be. And it may end up as a disaster. I'm not sure. But the question is, why are we in this situation? Why is it so difficult to transition to a more open society? I don't mean a fully democratic society because that has not been achieved, but at least a more open society And one of the reasons I've worked on this book that's coming out in about 6 months on the psychology of revolution is because again and again we find that revolutions fail people. Ordinary people are failed by revolutions. Most recently, we can look at the Arab Spring, we can look at the Iranian Revolution, on and on and on. Most revolutions against dictatorships have ended up bringing in a new dictatorship. And this goes back to, if you like, the French Revolution. Emperor Napoleon replaced the king. In the Russian Revolution, we had the replacement of the Tsar by other dictators, and now we have dictator Putin. In China, we've had the same challenge. Everybody thought, the middle class will grow in China and the middle class will democratize China. Well, it hasn't happened. Cuba and other countries where we thought democratization would happen after revolution, it hasn't happened. Why is this the trend? And why are we going backwards in terms of moving towards closed societies rather than open ones? Of course, I'm speaking with a very strong bias. My bias is that I prefer to live in open societies rather than closed ones. And there may be people who say this is an unjustified bias.
Thank you so much. So one comment, two follow-up questions, then we'll get to the audience. So, I live in Colombia in South America, and similar to and I've lived in lots of countries, and often I found in peace building work or related development work, people don't need necessarily outsiders to come in and save them, or, they're often doing incredibly dynamic, high impact work. What they often need is maybe capacity building around organization, access to networks, better learning, and then also sharing from other regions. So if you think about diversifying social psychology, is there really cutting edge research now coming out of Brazil or Indonesia? Or, if people want to understand how psychology or social psychology is becoming more inclusive, what journals or where do you go, not just to study the stuff coming out of North America and Europe?
One of the very constructive changes that has taken place, not just in psychology, but in all of research, is that there has been a tremendous growth in journals, publication outputs and outlets, and book publishing. So when I started almost 40 years ago, the mainstream journals and book publishers had a stranglehold. So if you wanted to publish, you had to conform to them in methodology, in ideology, and everything. Now there are many more outlets and people have the opportunity to publish. And fortunately, many of these outlets are now in non-Western societies. For example, I've just published a paper in an Indian journal, and this journal is focused on national development in non-Western countries, which is wonderful. This didn't exist before. So students today have much more opportunity to diversify in that sense. Now, at the same time, we should not forget there are some common challenges that all human beings have. One of these challenges, it seems to me, is the challenge of change and how to bring about change. My last book was on political plasticity. Political plasticity is about how fast and in what ways change can come about and can't come about. And in that book, I review areas like leadership and wealth disparities. And I show how over thousands of years, there has been very little change in leadership style and wealth disparities and the influence of religion and ethnicity and on and on and on. There are some areas where human behavior is very static. Think about it. In the most powerful nation in the world, our next election is probably going to be between two 80-year-old men. Why is it that for the last 10, 12,000 years, most societies have been led by authoritarian old men? Why is it that women have not broken through in the numbers they need to? Why is it that we don't have younger people represented well enough? Now, this is very static, and it's an area of low political plasticity where we seem to be stuck. And technology has not helped to bring about change. Everybody thought, the internet will change everything. Well, it hasn't. It's actually reinforced certain very static trends. So at the same time that I'm very happy that around the world now there are many outlets for publishing, there are many research centers, there are now applied centers for practice, we mustn't forget there are some common challenges that all human beings face. And one of them is the rigidity of our behavior and the difficulty of changing our behavior in certain domains.
Okay. So last question before we go to the audience. You've been doing a lot of your work over 4 decades, connecting research to policy suggestions and interfacing with others. So how do you know when whether it's a hypothesis, you've done some testing, you've done field research, how do you know whether a theory or some assumptions or data you have actually is or could have an impact in the policy world? And do you have any examples of, from your own work where a particular recommendation in terms of democratization or addressing inequality or increasing gender representation, where maybe you've had an indirect or direct influence, or another social psychologist, someone could say like a policymaker was doing it this way. I'll give you an example. So many, we have an alum who works for, or used to work for Collaborative Development Associates, Mary Anderson's group of Do No Harm. I'm on their advisory board. And they did an interesting project years ago in Kosovo, because the assumption was that they should put more funding into intergroup dialogue between Kosovar Albanians and Kosovar Serbs. And like, if you bring people together in dialogue, that's magically going to make things better. Their research was qualitative, but they basically said that's the wrong assumption. Like, we don't need more intergroup funding for dialogue. What we need is better public institutions to facilitate trust. And so, like, not that intergroup dialogue is wrong, but it was better to work on trust and institution building. And so, any examples you have from your own work or others, and kind of that kind of the research or data suggests something different than what policymakers are doing?
Yes, I could point to a number, but I'm just going to stick to 2 very briefly. One is that from the 1980s, I began to argue that social scientists and psychologists specifically in non-Western societies should be developing their own practices and their own research that is addressing the needs of those societies. And fortunately, this began to have an impact. And I think I was among a number of people making this argument. And I would say we have had some success now. And there's a generation of young researchers, young practitioners coming from non-Western societies that has taken this perspective. So that's one area. Another area that I would say has had some impact is research on prejudice and how to measure prejudice. And what we showed, and this is research with Don Taylor and a number of other people, we showed that when you're trying to assess prejudice, you need to be very careful in the measures you use, because a lot of the traditional measures really led to misunderstandings. And you could get very different results by simply rewording a question. So I think measures of prejudice have become more sophisticated as a result of our input.
Thank you so much. So I'll come back with a few questions, but I want to bring in some. So Matt's based in Colorado and works on sustainable investing. So his question is, do you have any suggestions from a psychology perspective of how we can move away from fossil fuels and growing consumption from a social psychology perspective? And obviously climate anxiety is becoming one of the, climate change is one of the biggest threats in the world, but associated that is climate anxiety. So any thoughts about that as well?
Of course, our use of fossil fuels is a behavioral tendency, and psychology is the science of studying behavior. So I would argue that psychology is at the heart of this. I am doing research right now with a number of other people, particularly a group located in Australia, where we're looking at environmental pollution, all these things, and movements to try to change our use of fossil fuels, etc. One of the things we must stress is that this is not an individual process, it's a collective process. And we often underestimate how much of our behavior is shaped by what's going on around us. So we've got to focus on the collective and changing the collective. And again, we have to turn against mainstream approaches. The mainstream approach is from cells to societies, from cells, neurons, to societies. I believe the right way to do it is from societies to cells. When we are born, there is already a society, and that society shapes us. It shapes not only our behavior, but also our neural circuits. Our brain takes shape through social interaction. So what we have to do is focus on collective processes in order to get change of behavior in areas such as fossil fuel use. Let me give you a quick example by what I mean. Everybody remembers that when COVID hit, there was a shortage of certain goods in shops. Tissues, toilet rolls, all kinds of things disappeared. Individually, we all knew that we were acting irrationally. Individually, we would talk to one another and say, yes, it's silly, everybody rushing to the shops to buy these things. But because of the collective process, a lot of us who thought this was illogical went along and bought the tissues and made shortages worse. So we have to look at the collective process rather than starting with the micro individual process.
Thank you so much. So just one comment, my brother and his son were just visiting last week, and I have a lot of mental health professionals in the family, and his son is completing a master's in social work. So we had a lot of the discussion, and they're an activist. We had a lot of discussions about how in the US, a lot of social work focuses on, let's say, individual social support versus Europe, it tends to be more activist.
Yes.
And so, that's one of the challenges in a lot of psychology in the US is that they're often, whether someone has a challenge or just wants to be more resilient, it's treated as an individual, not systematic challenge. And
yes, exactly.
any thoughts on that? Is psychology, or let's say mental health in general, which is different than social psychology? Is it moving a little bit more to systems approaches and looking at how so much of the challenges in the US, I mean, there are personal challenges, but a lot it's like the inability to have a living wage or find childcare or just, so any thoughts like where psychology is going on that? And has the APA ever taken a stance of saying, like, yes, we need more investment in mental health support, but it's also, unless structures change, these challenges are going to keep coming?
Yes, my book, How Psychologists Failed, is about exactly this issue. Psychologists failed by being reductionist. We failed because we focused on the micro, the individual, and increasingly we're now focusing on the brain and neural circuits and neurons, and we're failing to attend to society and the macro processes. And unfortunately, this happens in mental health. And in the books, How Psychologists Failed, I specifically attacked the positive psychology movement, which is current in the United States and is being exported to the rest of the world. See, the exportation of psychology from the United States follows the cultural power of the United States. And unfortunately, many non-Western societies have imported Western psychology, and specifically American psychology, in a very unthinking way. And so this is exactly what I've addressed in that book.
Hopefully lots of people will look it up because it is a wonderful book. So next question or comment is from Isaac in Singapore. He's just interested, didn't provide too much detail, but kind of pushing the boundaries in field research. So maybe how I would interpret that is, what do you think are the cutting edge questions that social psychologists are trying to address? I mean, you've already discussed some. And
well, there's no doubt that there's now greater diversity in methodology in research, not just in social psychology, but psychology broadly and social sciences. However, field research is still a minority in psychology, and it's still on the periphery. Mixed methodology is probably the best, but it's seldom ever done. In terms of what are the most important questions, I think at the moment in field research, these are linked to climate change. There's no doubt. What are the factors preventing people from changing their behavior to improve our situation with respect to climate change? What are the factors that mobilize collective action with respect to climate change? I think these are the most important questions, particularly for young people to address right now.
Thank you. So Fiza from Pakistan, I think we've been discussing this. This is a big question. How do you actually contribute towards the betterment of justice with the help of psychology? So that's a huge question, so feel free to address it in any way.
Again, I approach justice from a psychological perspective. I focus on subjective justice, how people feel about justice. And there are, first of all, a number of psychologists now working in law schools. For example, my friend Tom Tyler is at Yale Law School. He's a psychologist who works in law school looking at psychological processes underlying justice. And one of the questions for me is rights and duties. How do we move forward with respect to rights and duties so that justice is enhanced globally? I'm very interested in universals in justice. It seems to me that we have gone too far on relativism. Relativism is a big problem because it works against minorities. Relativism means that whoever has the biggest gun is the winner. we need to establish universals so that everybody is judged according to the law in the same way. And unfortunately, the United States has opted out of a number of key international agreements on, for example, the ICC. And that is a problem. Relativism is a problem. We have to move towards establishing universals in rights and duties. I would like to see a universal, a human rights. We have a human rights declaration. I would like to see a human duties declaration from the United Nations. The duties part is missing, particularly the duties of people in the West and other rich countries. China is coming up there towards the less affluent countries.
Yeah, it's interesting. The African climate summit's happening right now. It started yesterday, and there's a lot of talk, and that countries may contribute up to $100 billion a year. Contribute's not the right word, but might allocate or invest.
Yes.
But a lot of those promises around climate financing have turned, promises are there or words are there, but actions are not. And so,
yes.
So maybe that'll be one of your next campaigns, is to be in charge of drafting a responsibility of duties for either politicians or the human race at the UN.
Well, there have been attempts to try to move that forward, but we need the equivalent of Eleanor Roosevelt to spearhead this.
Okay.
And it seems to me we do need a United Nations Declaration on Human Duties.
Okay. Good. If anyone's listening who wants to work on that, feel free to comment. So Saurabh, I think from India, I'm not sure. While in the midst of a chaotic system, let me just summarize this. Basically what he's saying is, how do we show the significance of research in addressing the challenges in the world today, when there's so much reaction and it's hard to do forward thinking or forward policy thinking?
I would say there's a couple of different ways. One is simply teaching. A lot of people underestimate the impact of teaching. When you teach young people and help to shape their minds, that is a powerful impact on the future. That's number one. Second, I think we need to, working as researchers, work harder to write in a way that is more accessible. I mean, some people ask me, well, why do you bother writing books? Well, I write books because more people will read books than journal papers. It's just something more accessible. And also, we need to do better in translating research evidence into language that everybody can understand. And fortunately, there are now more people getting PhDs in areas that are really journalistic. That is, specializing in journalism that talks about research for the regular people without higher education. So I think those are two ways, but also participating in programs generally that reach larger numbers of people.
So I was talking to Catalina, my wife, who you know, and I mean, if you think about big behavioral and societal changes, for one, I think attitudes towards smoking in many societies. My father worked for one of the horrible tobacco companies for a few years. I mean, he used to bring home cartons of cigarettes, and he quit smoking 40 years ago. But I think when I grew up, I'm 52, that smoking was glamorized, and now in some societies, not all, like when you see people smoking, I've had a mental shift. So if you're kind of getting to that research influencing, that was both research about the danger of addiction, uncovering what the big tobacco companies lied about, changing policies, taxation. If you think about kind of what you're talking about, more people are getting PhDs and communicating with others, there's also less trust in experts these days than there was. So, I mean, kind of jumping around, but any thoughts? Because now, because of instant news and fake news and misinformation, even if you're a credible expert saying things that most people would say is valuable, people are contesting facts in ways that weren't before.
Yes.
So any thoughts from a social psychology perspective, how to best counter that, or how to best take the research and make it accessible, but also where people might listen to it?
Yes, yes. I think that's a very important question because it links back to the issue of the demise of democracy and the open society and the rise of authoritarian leadership, strongman leadership. In 2013, I finished a project on the psychology of dictatorship and published that as a book. One of the themes of dictatorship is that dictators are very anti-science. And the reason why they are very anti-science is because dictators are people who are individuals who put themselves as all-knowing. They present themselves as superpowers who know everything. That's how they get to be confident enough to close universities, for example. I go back to Mao's Cultural Revolution, where he closed all the universities and attacked intellectuals, etc. When I was in Iran in 1980, Khomeini attacked universities. I was there in the last day of the university being open in Tehran. Attacked universities and closed them. Why? Because dictators believe they know everything better than others. I think of the would-be dictator Donald Trump coming on live TV telling people to inject themselves with Lysol. He knows better than Fauci. And in my studies, I always listen to extreme right-wing radio shows. I read their material, and they constantly attack Dr. Fauci. Why? Because he stood up to the would-be dictator. He claimed he knew something based on science. Unfortunately, this attack on science has become pervasive, and it has led to more and more, particularly authoritarian personalities, to take up this slogan of being anti-science and being against higher education, basically, that these people know nothing. It's almost like going back to the Know Nothing party in America.
Yeah, I mean, one quick story, then we'll move on to questions. So we have a 12-year-old who you know, and my parents live in Sarasota, Florida. So I think about 6 months ago or a year ago, I had heard of the new college, and I went to University of Massachusetts. I took a class at Hampshire, which is very alternative, with Michael Clare. So we drove by maybe a year ago and said, oh, this is an interesting place. This could be somewhere Jacob might want to go in the future. And then if anyone, New College is a public university that's been very experimental, open-minded, very inclusive. And Ron DeSantis, the dictatorial governor of Florida, has just dismantled it within 6 months. And it's an interesting thing where they're going from science to just, certain limits. So it's happening all over the world.
Yes, exactly.
I'm going to bring in just a quick comment from Lucy. So a question she has is, any thoughts for people who have a PhD and don't want to stay in academia or cannot find a job, how to take the PhD and build a consulting or, a career outside of academia?
My sense is that academia is changing very fast, and it's not changing for the better. What do I mean by that? Well, it's becoming a place where decisions are based now on money rather than other criteria. And this is very unfortunate what's happening. Academics are having less and less influence. Administrators are having more and more influence. And these administrators are driven by money issues. So I'm not sure that not being in academia is missing out a lot. However, what to do with a PhD if you're not in academia? Well, first of all, there are now increasing numbers of places outside you can work with a PhD, including setting up your own business, including working for government entities. A number of my former students are now in the government rather than academia, and they're doing excellent work, influencing policy directly. The other thing to think about is, if you're going to set up your own company, what do you do? Well, I have a former student who works in the Washington, D.C. area, and he does a lot of survey work. I would advise you, if you're going to go into freelance work, to get skills in basic statistics and survey work, because that is always marketable. It's always marketable if you can do basic survey work, basic research, and the statistics that is needed with it. And also, a lot of the companies that used to have standard marketing departments now also contract out that work. So I think there is quite a lot of promise for work outside academia with a PhD. At the same time, the universities are going in a direction that, for me at least, very disappointing. You might know that in the United States and in some Western countries, European countries, there's been a decline in the humanities. Some universities have even closed down their humanities departments, which is astonishing, really.
Yes, I mean, West Virginia, I think State University is cutting most of their language. They're building lots of buildings, but underinvesting in faculty and academics. So just looking to see, we have about 5 more minutes. Just want to see, you got lots of thank yous for the comments. There's a question here from Ekaterina, I think in Republic of Georgia, I'm not sure. So you mentioned that students trained in research in Western countries, they're often raising questions in research, which mostly is relevant for Western countries. How do you balance this with the fact that there are global challenges? And you talked about this, that there are universal attributes of human behavior. So any thoughts on her specific question?
I do think that globalization is ongoing, despite the recent efforts to deglobalize. I think that globalization is ongoing. It's driven by economic factors and technological factors that are unstoppable. And we need to address issues such as climate change, which are global. However, there are still certain issues that are local. For example, there are still parts of the world where their basic problem is they need soap, and they need a soap factory. They need shampoo. They need basics that they don't have. Of course, they have super bright people there that could come to MIT in the United States and do research on bioengineering at a very advanced level, but that won't feed back to their third world country directly. So I do think there are certain local issues that need to be solved, and these are not going to come from Western universities. However, in the social sciences, there are certain basic questions, such as the inability of us to change in the area of leadership. Think about it. We could be making decisions collectively. We have the technology. Should we go to war? Well, that decision could be made collectively, but it's not. It's being made by George Bush or somebody equivalent. And I think that is an area of problems.
So we have about 3 minutes left. Feel free. People are making lots of comments and thanking. So I have two questions. The first is, do you classify yourself as a optimist, realistic pessimist? Because you've been studying and working on some of these local and global challenges for a long time. And obviously, the idea of linear progress, most people would disagree with, but there is a hope that at least we're advancing. So if you just think about your knowledge of humanity, your life experience, and your research, do you classify yourself anyway in terms of thinking about behavior of people and societies, and are we going to meet to some degree these huge challenges facing us, or we're just going to keep underperforming?
Well, I disagree with the right-wing view that some people espoused some time ago, that we've reached the end of history and capitalist democracy is the end of history. I also disagree with the Marxist view that we're going to reach the classless society, that is the end of history. I believe that human beings make history. There is no inevitable path. I would not want to predict whether at the end of the century, 21st century, we will still have democracies or not. That's up to us. And I would not like to predict whether we have improved our situation with respect to global warming. That's up to us. We can make our own history. We do make it all the time. And the challenge is for us to understand the rigidities, or what I call the political plasticity of our own behavior. In what ways can we change? In what ways is it extremely difficult to change, and why? Those are the mysteries for me. But in terms of the future, I'm completely open because it's not clear which directions we're leading.
Okay. One more big picture question, then just a quick ending one. If you think about inequality, which I would actually classify as a bigger challenge in climate change, it's equal, but it's underpinning a lot of climate change. How much, if you think about from your research, the most effective ways to address inequality, how much is about taxation? How much is about good public policy? How much is about behavioral change? Just saying, or corporate boards saying no CEO should make 350 times what a worker makes. Obviously, do you see any avenues as more, or should we have a global wealth tax? Like, if you had to suggest a few policy changes, how much would be on the behavioral end and how much would be on the policy end?
What is going to stop inequality in a capitalist world? Because I count China and Russia as in the capitalist world. One extreme response is from Walter Scheidel, who's written the book, The Great Leveler. His argument is the only thing that can stop inequality in the capitalist world is war, massive war. That's the only condition in which the super rich will agree to share their wealth. I'm more hopeful. I believe that taxation is possible as a way to reduce inequality. Thomas Piketty, in his great book on capital, suggests a global tax on the rich. We can't achieve that at the moment because of the huge disagreements between governments. But it seems to me at some stage we're going to have to think about global taxation, some kind of policy that is global. And I think Thomas Piketty is probably a century or two ahead of his time. Okay. But that seems to me possible.
And then the last question, there's two parts. The first is, do you have any favorite platforms that you recommend others look at just to stay informed on engaged psychology? And the second part of that, when you're not researching and writing your next book, any favorite literature you're reading or any shows or movies that are making you think in a creative way that you'd recommend to others?
Yes, thank you. Though I don't have a favorite platform, I tend to be very, very much in love with literature, with poetry, whereas Farsi poetry, English poetry, or whatever I can read. And I did a few years ago publish a book on Shakespeare and the experimental psychologist, where I argued that the origins of experimental psychology are not, as we often argue, to be found in the 19th century, etc., etc. The origins of experiments can actually be found in Shakespeare's work, and in that era, in the era that Shakespeare was working, they were already thinking of experimentation on human behavior. And in that book on Shakespeare and experimental psychology, I go through Hamlet and some other plays showing how there are experiments in Shakespeare's plays.
Okay. So thank you so much for sharing generously your time and energy. And sorry that I can't give you chocolate in person. I did give you a little bit when I saw you last month. And thank you everyone for watching and participating from Mongolia to Togo and the US. This episode goes up immediately on LinkedIn and YouTube. I know one or two people said they had problems with the audio. And then within 2 weeks, it'll be converted to one of our podcast episodes. Please check out Dr. Moghaddam's website, read his books, share his work, and stay tuned for his forthcoming book. And then PCN, you can check out our resources. And then this is the start of season 11. So we try to do it most weeks, but stay tuned because there's lots of amazing guests from all over the world. And Dr. Moghaddam, thank you again so much for sharing.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.
Okay. And thank you, everyone.